Hello, my name is Dr. Laura, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I co-own a group practice, and my passion is working with people who have experienced abuse and neglect in childhood and have developed trauma disorders as adults, whether that's complex PTSD or dissociative disorders. I have been doing this for a good 20 years now, and I have learned so much, both from other professionals, but also from each and every one of my clients. And as I am nearing the middle of my career, I am thinking that I would really love to share some thoughts with all of you about some of the things I've learned and some of my observations. And I'm also open to hearing your thoughts and observations, whether you are also a clinician working with clients, or whether this is personal, whether this applies to your life or people you know, or maybe even both. So, yeah, enjoy and let me know what you think. Welcome to the Impact of Abuse and Neglect in Our Narcissistic Family Systems, Part 7. In this part, we're going to continue talking about narcissistic defenses. We're on Part 3, and on this section, we're going to be talking about the defenses that have to do with our natural impulse to flee or flight. We're going to start by talking about actual physical ways that people attempt to flee when in a narcissistic family system, but even more, maybe not even more importantly, but children cannot physically flee very often. And so we're also going to spend time, a significant amount of time, talking about mental ways that people flee in their mind. So I put this under flight because it's a form of flight, but it's preemptive flight, and that would be hiding. If you're a kid and you know that you might get yelled at or hurt, it is natural to hide from the person who might do that to you. As you can see from the photo, unfortunately, this is a fairly ineffective technique, as adults can usually find kids. However, it is certainly a major one for a lot of kids. And, some kids have multiple hiding places throughout their home. I also wanted to mention hiding because if this is a primary strategy for a kid in a narcissistic family system, if that's you, you might experience issues as an adult with not wanting people to look at you or see you, and feeling most comfortable when you're not noticed at all. And that can be a longer term impact of relying upon hiding as a child. Now we're going to all the many mental forms of flight. I guess I didn't technically say physically running away is an option, but generally it's actually not if you're certainly a child in a narcissistic family system. If you're one of the parents, maybe, but even that is not an actual, well, yes, flight if you're a parent and you're the non-abusive parent, actually leaving the house and taking the kids with you is a form of flight. But I'm not going to talk more in depth about that here. I'm more wanting to talk about, starting in childhood, what a child is able to do. So the first form of flight is addiction. And that's basically doing something actively to your body to distract you from the distress of shame or humiliation, feeling ignored, feeling invisible, I would add, feeling helpless, and feeling numb, which happens too. So when people think of addiction, they typically think of drugs and alcohol and maybe things like binge eating or gambling. But I think it's important to know what this looks like in a kid. And even a very, very young child can start manipulating their body to try to regulate their emotions. And if the child does not have a solid attachment to an adult in the home, shifting your bodily state is actually something. I have never met someone with narcissistic abuse and neglect in childhood that had not formed some type of addiction early in childhood. And these tend to be things like manipulating, either eating a lot or eating a little if the kid has control, refusing to use the bathroom, and endless ways to cause pain. Banging your head, picking your skin, holding your breath. The possibilities are endless, and kids will experiment with this starting when they're very little. The next form of mental flight is fantasy. And I wanted to mention this. I've actually seen this reasonably often in adults, including adults that overall are doing pretty well. But they'll say, I can't shake this fantasy thing. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? And basically, what it is as a kid, they learn to fantasize so that even though they couldn't mentally escape their environment, physically you couldn't escape it, mentally you could escape it. Um, Sometimes the fantasy world is about soothing the child from the narcissistic neglect. So in their family, they don't feel important, they don't feel special, they don't feel like they matter. So sometimes the fantasy is about some kind of success. And as an adult, it could be, the ideal love interest, or, you have this amazing career, or that one great piece of art, or something. And often, when adults talk to me, they don't even know why they do this. And, but usually I found if I sit with them on it, it's basically solace. When they start to feel bad about themselves, then there's a world in which they, are valuable, they're important, they're special. Sometimes the fantasy world is kind of magical, like the kid has superpowers to like defeat whatever the bad situation is, or to rescue family members, one of the parents, or siblings from whatever it is. Sometimes it's a fantasy world in which people get punished. I've definitely had adults that have those fantasy worlds where it seems so terrible. There's so much rage and humiliation that the solace is to have fantasies, sometimes very violent actually, about that person being punished, right? And this is left over from being a kid, and bad things happen, and nobody is held accountable. So in your fantasy, you can, if they need to get punished, they can get punished. How do I know a kid is doing this? Well, the kid is probably not going to announce it to you. In a kid, it can look like ADHD, like the kid, especially the inattentive, what we used to call inattentive type. Um, and if they'll talk about it, well, we can talk a little bit about in adults, there's this diagnosis that's not in the DSM-5 yet, but there's some research on it, and there's crossover with people who dissociate, though it's an incomplete crossover of this diagnosis called maladaptive daydreaming. And that's when you spend so much time in that world, like you're not really in this one. That's what that is. So I wanted to talk about more extreme development of the fantasy world. Sometimes in a narcissistic family system, the external world is so bad that basically the internal fantasy is not just the fantasy of, one part of the self. It is a fantasy world in which different parts of the self sort of interact, and there's an internal space. And children with significant dissociative disorders, and certainly adults with dissociative disorders, talk about having a headspace often. Not everyone, but very often there's this sense of there's these different characters, and the characters are different parts of you and have different functions, and they interact in this entire fantasy space. And the fantasy space it can be extremely elaborate. Sometimes there's all kinds of rooms or different, portals, different kinds of fantasy worlds. Not everyone is equally prone to creating fantasy space in general, even people with, whether or not you have a dissociative disorder. But I will say this can be incredibly detailed, and it can certainly take a lot of time. And, you know, um, and so that's something. And so if I have somebody that has any kind of like, if you're a client of mine and you have any kind of significant internal world fantasy space, that's definitely something I'm interested in, and talking with you about and figuring what is the function of it. And I will say, usually, if it's a narcissistic family system and there's a lot of narcissistic abuse or neglect, um, at least if the person is using the fantasy world for solace, it has to do with the things I talked about in the previous slide. If it's just trying to figure out how to manage the outside world, that's a different kind of internal world where there's parts that are basically trying to do different jobs in the person's life and actual life. So some parts exist only inside, some go on the outside and have different functions in the world, but that would be a whole nother presentation. Okay, so hiding, and then there's the aspect of flight of hiding from oneself. So it's not taking oneself and jumping into the fantasy world, it's hiding from what is inside of oneself. And this inherently involves dissociation. Um, and if the abuse and neglect is so bad that a child must dissociate, I promise the first thing they will dissociate, meaning put in a box, set it over here, probably not even be fully aware it's in there. The first thing that gets dissociated is the worst of your parents' abuse. That's the first thing to go in there. And so, and and very often, the kind of internal experience is that those parts truly don't exist when the child is doing day-to-day things or the adult is doing day-to-day things. But when I have worked with, well, especially teenagers and adults with this, the internal experience is like almost like there's a part of them that's stuck in that moment, reliving it over and over again. And so, and those trauma parts, those trauma holding child parts, will get triggered by things in day-to-day life. So why do kids do this? Well, it's not, when researchers first started talking about this, they described it as, well, it's just too much, so the kid had to dissociate it. And certainly there is an aspect of it that either the abuse is too much or the affection and attention is too little. In other words, the neglect. But the reason that you dissociate the worst of what your parents do is that if you look at the dolls at the bottom here, we have the attached doll, and the child needs to attach to the parent, right? And so in order to attach to the parent, they must flee, the second adult, from the worst of the memories so they can fawn, i.e., be what the parent wants them to be in order to get some attachment needs met. So it's actually a trifecta of the attached part, of a flight part, probably a trauma holding part, which I don't have on here, and a fawning attempt, so that the child that interacts with the parents when the abuse isn't happening or when it's less, is not frightened of the parent and can maintain a fawning or submissive attitude toward the parent rather than fighting back. So this one I think is important too. Another way to hide from yourself that is learned in childhood is children dissociate the mistakes they made. So they do not remember, when asked, the things they did to get in trouble, that adults are mad at them for. And there's, I mean, practically speaking, I mean, the child may experience that there is part of them that is bad and does the bad things. And then there's another part of them that talks to mom and dad and is like, well, I don't know about these bad things. But more broadly speaking, well, why would the child dissociate from things they had done that were a problem? Well, I mean, it allows you to feel like you're good. And remember, if you're bad, guess what? Abuse, neglect, trauma, humiliation. And so a child not knowing that they did some of the bad things allows them to hold on to a fragile sense of, I'm good enough, I'm good, see, I'm good. And some adults actually do this too and do not know they're doing it. I know, I mean, and from the outside, certainly people just lie too. But this is not just simply lying to yourself, but you don't have full access to the information. Okay, so much more could be said about all of this, as with all of the parts of my presentation, but this section 7, has been on the narcissistic defensive flight. I hope it's been helpful for you. And the next section is the final section, and I'm going to talk about submission responses as a narcissistic defense.